Bit of a false start there, but let's get started nonetheless. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Andrew. I'll be your podcast host. We're talking about an interesting topic. Last week, we discussed abiding and how relationships are this thing that generates between people. And I thought let's duck back to that, because there's so many more stones to unturn. We don't have a guest this week. We're sort of just getting started, and I'm troubleshooting a few things. Appreciate you guys staying with me. I think we've got the video working properly, but I guess I'll get to find out near the end of the video. So welcome to another episode. When I was thinking about what to share today, my thoughts I can't help but think about in the beginning. Now, if you've grown up Christian, in the beginning is a thing that you've heard so often. The story of in the beginning, it begins the same way all the time. We're telling the same story over and over again, believing that it's profound, but not knowing how to penetrate more depth than we've heard maybe 100 times before. I'd like to uncover something different, something that I've found to be foundational. Something you may not know is that the book of Genesis is sort of a primer for the rest of the Bible. It's written in such a way to set up your expectations, to bring your attention to certain themes, to make you aware of certain writing conventions that we don't have anymore, several thousand years later. But back at the time, they paid attention to some very sophisticated writing tools. Imagine all the people who work together to make an amazing film. The credits roll on for ages. The same level of depth and detail and sophistication and work and collaboration goes on with the Bible. But we don't get to see that. We see the finished product. We don't get to see the credits. And so it pays to kind of slow this thing down, to pay attention to what is sort of going on just outside our periphery. Anyway, enough preamble. Let's get started. So, in the beginning, God creates human beings on the sixth day. And the very first thing God does after that point is he rests. But this notion of rest, it's not an exhausted rest. It's kind of this notion of coming close and enjoying, spending time ceasing from your labor so that you can enjoy. And it's the first thing human beings do after being created is they've got work to do, but the first thing they do is join God in this rest. And it's a fascinating thing to reflect that we don't work towards rest, we work from it as a matter of human beings, not human doings. Now, in the beginning, man was created in God's image. And when the Bible uses the word man, obviously, this is sort of old language for mankind. It's not gender specific. It's mankind. Man and woman are included in this title. So mankind is created in God's image. And whatever your reflections have been regarding what that image is, there is a likeness there. There is a relatability. There is, I know this person because I am like this person. Sometimes you meet a friend who, I think C.S. Lewis actually was the first person I heard say this. Like, you meet two friends in your lives. One is someone who is so very much unlike you, and the other one makes you feel like like you're not alone. Oh, there's someone else like me. Now, when it comes to the beginning of the biblical story, this creation, and then very, very soon after, the fall, we read it in a very straightforward way, but we read it with our own Western understanding. Now, that's to be expected, to be honest. Like, you read all things, projecting, sort of filling in the gaps using your own familiarities, your own understanding of story and symbol and everything. And it takes a really long time to kind of backtrack out of our own culture and try to approach things more from the culture in which the Bible was written. But I've done something as well. Like, there's the exegetical, deep dive, scholarly, look it up in the ancient Hebrew kind of approach. But then there's also reading the Bible through the lens of my counselling studies. And I discovered something really fascinating when I did that. When you read parts of the Bible through the lens of what does this say about who we are, how we function, how we become broken, and how we might become healed, different things stand out. And it's not to discount the biblical exegetical scholarly approach. That adds tremendous value. But what I've found is that when I dig deep on the exegetical side and I dig deep on the psychological side, they tend to meet in the middle, beneath the surface, way down deep. And I've always fallen in love with that, because the insights that I gain, it blows my mind. So God creates man in his own image. But then in chapter 3, when Eve is being tempted by the serpent, he says, God knows that the day you will eat of the fruit, the forbidden fruit, you will become like God. And I realized, oh, hang on, this might be intentional. It's hard to kind of decipher what the original deception was. But I think it's this. God created you in his image. And the snake says, to be in God's image, you must do this. There's something subtle going on beneath the surface there. It's like who you really are is who you really are. You can rest in that. You can trust that. You can be that. But when you believe that there's actually something separating you and who you really are, or who you're meant to be, you create an obstacle between where you are now and where you are supposed to be. And you live as though that obstacle is there, separating you from what's supposed to be. But it doesn't change that God did create you in his image. So what do we do with this paradox? On the one hand, we have God who says, you've been made like God. In some way, you are like him. And then you have the serpent, the deceiver, saying, you are not like God now, but to become like God, you must do X. The implicit belief is, you are not like God now. When I look at that, I think it seems to have created some kind of schism between, but like in the very heart of our sense of identity. And the thing about identity is it's intricately tied to relationship. I'm not a son unless I have a father. I'm not an employee unless I have an employer. I'm not a student unless I have a teacher. My sense of identity, my knowing of myself moving forward in life, is directly linked to my relationships with other people. And so when God says, I've created you in my image, and the deceiver says, you are not yet in God's image, and when you eat of this fruit, you will become like God. You first believe, I am not like God now. But what happens when the promise of that fruit fails to deliver? The fruit cannot deliver on its promise of making you like God. In fact, Adam and Eve experience shame. They are exposed in a very literal way. And shame is an interesting thing too. Shame speaks about our identity. Shame says, you are not worthy. Now, in last week's episode, we mentioned how, actually, I'm not sure if we did, the baby being held by its parent experiences itself being experienced by their parent. And if their parent experiences their child with joy, the child experiences joy, and it builds that towards a sense of identity. I am someone who is worthy of joy and gives joy to others. But if your experience of yourself from your parents is negative, harsh, judgmental, dismissing, all of that, that becomes the basis of your own self-esteem and self-worth. It's like, oh, I'm worthy of rejection. I'm worthy of chastisement. Well, it's a similar thing here in the Garden of Eden. When Adam and Eve feel exposed, there's a shame that descends. They are naked and in need of covering. And it's so fascinating, actually. I discovered this a little while ago. The fruit of the tree promised something it couldn't deliver. When they acted on that belief, that false belief that they are not who they really are, they experience shame and exposure. Not only do they try to cover themselves with fig leaves or the leaves of the tree, but when God comes looking for them, they hide. It could be read this way. They hide in the tree. It's almost like you believed this promise, but you couldn't turn away from it, because once you acted on it, you believed it deep in yourself. And instead of turning around, you went deeper into it. First, you eat the fruit, then you cover yourself, then you retreat into the tree to hide. Now, what happens when God brings them out and has a conversation with them? There's an interesting blame game that develops. Adam blames God for giving him Eve and blames Eve. So God turns to Eve, and Eve blames the serpent. There's this obfuscation of responsibility. They are victims, but they're not taking responsibility for what they did. And they feel shame and defensive. There's kind of this argument that develops. And what ends up happening is they can no longer stay in the Garden of Eden. The name Eden means delight. And they are sent outside the garden where an angel guards the entrance with a flaming sword. And in order to cover themselves, because the fig leaves are not sufficient, an animal is sacrificed and they wear its skin. And this is how this biblical story begins. And it's so fascinating. Not because we read it as history, although you may believe it as history, but because we believe it as having deeper meaning. These elements were mentioned for a reason. There is depth and nuance and symbolism and richness and meaning behind everything that's included in this story. So I'll tell you how I read it as a counselor. When we trust something to deliver what it cannot deliver, we're wounded. We're wounded in a way that something inside is disrupted. We call it trauma. Trauma is like we think the story is going this way, but it's cut off. And we're in the middle of the story we thought we were in. Oh, if I eat the fruit, then I'll become like God. And who doesn't want that? But the story cuts short and you don't know where to go from there. They experience shame. They experience kind of, what does it mean when you don't believe who you really are anymore? Like, what happens when you lose sight of who you really are? What happens is you stop acting like yourself. Now, this is a really interesting thing. No one really warned, I don't think people warn you when you get married, that you're going to find yourself in these really intense arguments and you no longer are acting like yourself. But that's what's going on in this story. It's easy, I think, to forget that the Adam and Eve story is at the same time the story of young love. You've got these two people, the first people, but also the first people in relationship, and they experience a rupture of who they really are. And they start acting out against one another. They point the finger. They're no longer an us or a we. They are against one another. The adversary has turned them against one another. And what seems to sort of come out of this is they don't they can't save themselves out of that state. Themselves is what they've lost track of. So how can they themselves save them? They need someone else from outside to notice this. Now, what happens in a relationship when you fall into a state of defensiveness and hostility and feeling like a victim? Counselors have actually coined various terms for this, but the one that I use is Cartman's drama triangle. Now, Cartman's drama triangle, imagine a triangle. I need to get some graphics, but each point on the triangle is an identity. But when you're in this triangle, you can only choose one, and everyone else in the world falls into one of the other two. This story is a narrative device that we find ourselves living inside of. When we're in it, it eclipses everything else. It becomes not something we see, but something we see through and something we see by. It decodes what we're looking at. The three roles are these: victim, savior, persecutor. I was talking to a friend I've talked to a few friends about this actually, about how when you get into these fights with your spouse, especially with your spouse, you might feel like a victim and your needs are not being met. And so you reach out to your partner to be your savior. Please give me this thing that I need. But sometimes it comes out as an accusation. Your partner, on the other hand, feels like you're the perpetrator and you're accusing them and you're pointing the finger and you're saying all these mean things. So now they feel defensive. They feel like they're the victim. And they start treating you like the perpetrator because you're not being the savior. What happens when we fall into this triangle is we go round and round into these different roles. We can't see anything outside of them, and we act as though that story was true. That is what we see in the Garden of Eden. Adam and Eve fall into this triangle, and they start pointing the fingers. They each feel like the victim, and someone else is the perpetrator. Someone else is responsible for how I've been hurt. And when that is exposed and they are not taking responsibility, it means that they can no longer stay in the garden of delight. Now, delight is it is a good word for describing the early honeymoon period of a relationship. The time when the two of you have come together and you're developing together this space between you, this relationship that has a life of its own. Each of you is cultivating it, something like a garden. And it's something that you are working on, but it's also something you live within. As you feed it, it feeds you. But because their identity is shifted, because they are exposed and do not take responsibility, they must leave the garden. It's almost like the loss of of the beautiful potential of what that relationship could have been. You cannot stay. And the interesting thing is, you've got an angel guarding the garden with a flaming sword. And I thought, man, a flaming sword is something that both burns and cuts. And I thought to myself, I wonder if that's sort of a visceral explanation, a visceral description of what it's like trying to re-enter that place of vulnerability and delight, but not being able to trust your partner to be a safe place to help you steward that relationship once more. Instead, life becomes difficult, both with work and with family. Both partners experience life as being much harder because they're not able to cultivate the garden. Now, the symbol of killing an animal and wearing its skin is a fascinating one. The way that I understand it is something like this. When you experience being in the triangle, defending yourself, justifying yourself, doubling down on your story and trying to convince the other person of how they've wronged you, you are identifying with that story. And so for all intents and purposes, what needs to die is you. Or more specifically, the you you're identifying with in this triangle narrative, the false self that you've believed in by rejecting that you've been created by God in the very beginning to be like him. That part of me that wants most to defend myself, to have the last word, to win the argument, that part of me is the part that needs to be laid on the altar. The willingness to do that covers your shame. And it's the last thing you'd ever want to do. It's the last thing you'd think to do, unless someone showed you the way. Now, all of this sort of sets up the whole story of the Bible. We've got identity in relationship with God. We've got the deception that you can reach out and get what you need on your own, but it's actually motivated by lies. You've got idolatry, which is the object, whatever object it is, that's promising something it can't deliver based on a false apprehension. Then you've got trauma that stays in the body and causes you to compensate in, we say, maladaptive ways, insufficient ways, that are ultimately dysfunctional on their own. And then you've got the fracturing of relationships and how we morally relate to one another. And then you've got kind of this exile from the place you were made to inhabit. All of this summed up in essentially one chapter. It's so rich. I love it. Now, if we move on to the next story, we have Cain and Abel. And I won't get deeply into this story, but Cain becomes jealous of his brother. His brother is doing what has been asked of him, to continue this tradition of symbolically acting out this redemptive pattern of sacrificing an animal on the altar and it being acceptable to God. But Cain, he thinks about it differently. He's a groundskeeper. He's, and it's ironic, Cain is a groundskeeper, a gardener like his father. But Abel is tending to the flock, to the sheep, to these animals that play a role in this redemptive pattern. And when Cain thinks that he can sacrifice the fruit of his own work and it be acceptable, he finds that it's not. The fruit of his own work is not going to be enough for the redemptive pattern. And naturally, he gets angry. Now, why would you get angry? Except that you believe that you've been wronged, that you're a victim, and someone else is at fault. Maybe it's Abel who's getting who's getting the approval that he wants. Or maybe it's God who's focusing on Abel instead of on Cain. Whatever the case, God comes to Cain and asks him a fascinating question. He says, "Why are you downcast? If you do well, won't it work out for you?" It's almost like a craftsman blaming his tools. It's like we can point at the world and talk about why things aren't working for me is because of X, Y, Z, and so. And what God's saying is, no, take responsibility for your actions. You've chosen to go down a path that's not working. If you did things right, if you did what you were supposed to do, won't things work out for you? It's as easy as that. But instead, Cain holds on to his own justification. In a marriage, as well as in many other situations, when we justify ourselves, a biblical term might be self-justification. I'm right because of X, Y, and Z. But you could think of it another way as well. When I think I'm right and I'm willing to justify myself, the Bible also calls that as self-righteousness. I'm in the right. Justice should be done to validate me. But of course, it's our warped perception of justice from inside the triangle. God says something else to Cain. He says, sin is crouching at the door like an animal, crouching at the gate, waiting to pounce and make you his prey. That's a very interesting... We haven't heard anything about sin up until now. And the way God describes it is, it's like a predatory animal waiting at the gate, waiting for its moment to pounce and strike and make you its prey. And it's like, I imagine something like a tiger, but the snake in the garden was a predatory animal. And an animal that's known for its calculated strikes. It's almost like this snake is growing. And so he's told, it wants to rule over you, but you must rule over it. Now, this is how I read it as a counselor. When we experience trauma, it's a state, an emotional, psychological state with its own narrative perception, beliefs, memories, emotions, thinking patterns. All of that's condensed in this state. And when it gets triggered, when that state gets triggered, it sort of rises up inside of our bodies. And sometimes it can be so overwhelming that it eclipses our higher order thinking. All of a sudden, we don't have the objectivity to step back from the situation and think, oh, you know, I could do X, Y, and Z, but some of these things are not a good idea at all. I think I'll go wash my hands and have something to eat. When these states are triggered, they fill us up. Our own presence of mind disappears. And all we can think of is the narrative, is the story of how we've been wronged. And these false beliefs, more of them come up. And instead of Cain following the advice that God gives, sin's desire is for you, but you must rule over it. He goes to Abel and he kills him. And we don't know what form that confrontation took, but it might have been the same dynamic of, if I go to my brother and kill him, that will satisfy my anger and my offense and the way that I perceive I've been wronged. I'm going to go and I'm going to let out all that anger on my brother and end up killing him. You can see how that promise is not going to deliver what he thinks it's going to deliver, right? But we all know what it's like to fall into that state and for those feelings to just sort of overwhelm us, and for our thinking to be trapped in these loops of, if I need to do something about this feeling, and instead of sacrificing my own self on the altar, instead of accepting responsibility and grieving the loss of that part of myself, I'm going to act out towards other people. I'm going to believe the lie. I'm going to act in a way that I am the character in that story. Now, it's a fascinating thing that Jesus says to the Pharisees. We're fast forwarding like a lot. Let's jump ahead to Jesus talking to the Pharisees. He says, "You are the children of the one whom you obey." You are the children of the one whom you obey, and the one you obey is the devil. Now, those are harsh words. And perhaps he was trying to get through to them. But in that same way, they kind of reacted like Cain. You know, so, oh, this guy's hitting a sore spot. He must be the problem. Let's get rid of him. But here's that principle. You are the children of the one whom you obey, the one whom you believe, the one whom you identify with. So if you identify with God and you do what Jesus did and allow yourself to be sacrificed on the altar so that you can be restored to new life in true righteousness, you are the son of the one whom you obeyed. But the converse is also true. You are the son of the deceiver if you believe the lie and you act it out as though it was true. The deceiver, I discovered this last year, actually. Fascinating insight I discovered. It was like, how do I put this? When there were a couple of things that really triggered me. But I found myself brooding over this story one time and realizing, hang on, I'm not being motivated right now by what's true. What I'm saying is not because it's true. I'm saying it because it's justifying how I feel. And as I dug deeper, I thought, okay, well, how am I feeling? What is the attitude of my thinking? And this actually became like a mantra of mine for a little while. I'm thinking things in a way that tells the story in a very disempowering way, in a very victimizing way, in a very perpetrating way. Let me question that narrative. So I thought, okay, what's the attitude of my story? And I thought, okay, well, there's judgment. In order to be judgmental, you need to be superior. So there's superiority. There's implicit condemnation in it. And I started sort of sifting down, and I eventually got to these two attributes of the thought process that was going through my mind. And I thought, oh, first, how I'm thinking is oppositional by its very nature. There's me and there's them. Therefore, it's divisive. The second part, though, is that it was accusatory, judgmental, condemning. And I thought, oh, hang on, isn't there a word in the Bible that means both adversary and accuser? It's the word for the devil. I thought, oh, so if we look at this with the spiritual lens and the psychological lens together, I'm being animated by the spirit of the devil, of the deceiver. And I thought, well, that's a powerful thought. And it gave me something very tangible to repent of, to turn from that path or that neural pathway, as the case may be, and instead put myself on a different path. And for probably better part of that year, I realized when I'm in that state, when I'm seeing things through the triangle, I cannot think of a better way to describe it. I cannot make sense of what's going on around me any better than I already have. That's why the story is so convincing. It's the best, it's the only logic we know to use to make sense of all the details. But I knew it wasn't true. Not on the basis that it didn't make sense, but on the basis that it wasn't godly. It wasn't empowering. If it's a disempowering story, how can that be the story? So, I would tell God, look, I don't know what the better narrative is. All I know is that the one I'm telling right now is the wrong one. It may justify me. It may make me feel better. It may make me feel like I'm right and everyone else is wrong. It might give me that level of satisfaction. But I'd been going around in circles in that story, looking for a resolution to the story arc and never finding it. I must have been telling that same story for like 10 years. Does not have an ending. And so I thought, okay, God, I'm laying this side of me on the altar and I'm going to back away. I don't know what the new story is. I just know this is the wrong one and I surrender it. I'm not going to tell that story anymore. And I found myself over the next month or two, if I started down that line of thought, that very well practiced line of thought, I'd catch myself, I'd stop myself, and I may not have anything else to say, but I'll put my hand over my mouth and I'll say, I'm not going to say anything at all then. And something really interesting happened. Because I was no longer indulging this victim narrative or this self-justification narrative or the I'm right and everyone else is wrong kind of narrative. However true my research might have been, it was the wrong story and it was coming from the wrong place. And so when I stopped entertaining that, two things happened. First, a lot of very deep and difficult feelings started coming up over the course of the next few weeks. Deep and difficult feelings that I had kept down by telling this story. And the second thing that happened was a new story. It's not even that a new story developed. It was like I could breathe again and I could see things more clearly. And I just knew that there was more to what was actually happening. And I could talk about it now with greater presence of mind, greater fairness, greater nuance. It wasn't all black and white. I wasn't pushing a crusade. I no longer had an agenda to win. I'd become freed of the story that had entrapped me for years and the trauma that I'd been carrying around that was fueling that story and the story was keeping in place. And I got to move on. I got to start writing a new story, changing the way I thought about it, no longer getting triggered all the time. You are the son of the one whom you obey. Your sense of identity is not just how you understand yourself. That would be self-concept, right? But your identity is something much deeper than that. It's in the heart. It's in this deeply embodied place. And sometimes parts of us can become activated and we'll act out a story that's not actually ours. We've adopted it under false pretenses, like eating a fruit. And because we've identified with a certain role within a certain story, our actions are justified. And we'll relate to everyone else through the lens of that distorted story, expecting everyone to justify how we see it. And I wonder if that's what the tree of the knowledge of good and evil meant, what that title suggests. The tree of knowing good and evil, I think of as when you're arguing with your spouse and you know, without a doubt, I am right and you are wrong. You are the perpetrator. I'm the victim. It's the tree of good and evil. Incidentally, the word evil in the Old Testament can mean evil, but it can also mean destructive. Maybe that's the real answer to this, is when you can see you're being destructive and you're justifying yourself, that's the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. That's eating of a narrative where you get to be right and someone else gets to be wrong. But you never get to accept responsibility, and the story never stops going round and round in circles. Instead, what the tree of life represents and what the altar represents is a willingness to surrender our I'm rightness in lieu of re-entering connection and relationship. If we're able to do that as the first thing we need in a relationship, in a new relationship, if we're able to put ourselves on the altar, to recognize a shared narrative, to accept responsibility and make confession, not only will we not build up traumas and further distort how we appreciate our circumstance with our partner, but maybe we can create a Garden of Eden between us that as we cultivate it, we're also able to keep the snakes out. Maybe that is what the early creation and fall narratives are actually getting at, is that there is a way that, aligned with God, you can walk in such a manner that you keep the snakes out, that you know who you are, and that you relate to one another as bone of my bone and flesh of my flesh. That when we enter into relationship, we are part of one system. It's not me against you. It's us participating in the same process that we call relationship. And that relationship is like a garden that, if we both cultivate it right, will be a source of delight and life and nourishment. Well, that's pretty good for one more episode. I think we'll leave it there, shall we? Building some foundational concepts for moving forward. These are some ideas that we'll certainly get into with greater depth down the track, and perhaps next time I'll have a guest to talk to. We'll see. But until then, wishing you all the very best. Thank you for joining me and coming with me on this journey of exploration and insight. And I really hope the video quality's worked out this time. But even so, we'll continue working. All the very best. My name's Andrew. See you next time.